This episode is sponsored by Sentry.io. Recently, I came across a great tool for tracking and monitoring problems in my apps. Then I asked them if they wanted to sponsor the show and allow me to share my experience with you. Sentry provides a terrific interface for keeping track of what's going on with my app. It also tracks releases so I can tell if what I deployed makes things better or worse. They give full stack traces and as much information as possible about the situation when the error occurred to help you track down the errors. Plus, one thing I love, you can customize the context provided by Sentry. So, if you're looking for specific information about the request, you can provide it. It automatically scrubs passwords and secure information, and you can customize the scrubbing as well. Finally, it has a user feedback system built in that you can use to get information from your users. Oh, and I also love that they support open source to the point where they actually open sourced Sentry if you want to self-host it. Use the code DevChat at Sentry.io to get 2 months free on Sentry's small plan. That's code DevChat at Sentry.io. Hey, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Ruby Rogues podcast. This week on our panel, we have Eric Berry.
Hey!
David Richards.
Hello!
Dave Kimura.
Hey, everyone.
I'm Charles Max Wood from devchat.tv, and this week we have a special guest, and that's Prathamesh Sonpatki.
Hello, everyone.
Do you want to introduce yourself real quick?
Sure. So my name is Prathamesh. I'm based out of Pune, India. I work for BigBinary. You might have heard about BigBinary from some of our blog posts. We publish a lot of blog posts on Ruby, Rails, and you might have come across some of those. I have also spoken at some conferences like RailsConf, RubyConf Singapore, and some other conferences. And I'm also co-organizer of RubyConf India and Deccan RubyConf, the two Ruby conferences in India.
That sounds like fun. I've always wanted to make it out there. I actually worked for a company a few years ago that had me working with a QA team out of India, and they kept talking about sending us out. I actually filled out the paperwork to get a visa, and then I wound up leaving the company, but yeah.
Actually, getting a visa for US citizens has become a lot easier these days. You can get a e-visa very quickly. So, if you need an excuse to come in here, I think you can come next year for the 10th edition of RubyConf India, which is happening in January.
That would be a ton of fun. Well, we brought you on to talk about Rails 5. And it looks like you've given a couple of conference talks about it. Do you want to just talk about a little bit about what you've been doing with Rails 5 and what you've been digging into with testing and hidden features of Rails 5?
So I had given a few talks on features of Rails 5 as well as testing changes in Rails 5. So during the Rails 5 release, some of the major changes happened in the testing scenarios. For example, in the previous versions of Rails, the controller tests used to work differently, and now they work a bit differently. Now the focus is more on integration testing, end-to-end testing, rather than the functional level testing, where you just test that a controller action worked successfully and some 200 or 400 response returned. Instead of that, now the more focus is on end-to-end testing, because even if we test whether the controller returned a proper response or not, that doesn't mean whether your page actually showed what you expected. So during the subsequent releases after Rails 5, there is also a feature for system tests, which was introduced in, I think, Rails 5.1, wherein you can run your Capybara test within Rails. You can generate those tests without adding extra dependencies. The feature is itself present in Rails. So that was one of the biggest change that happened during the Rails 5.1 releases in the testing philosophy in the Rails apps.
So we've been able to run Capybara tests for a while to do end-to-end tests. And what you're saying is that now you don't have to pull in like the Capybara web. What is it?
Yes. So the gem, earlier you have to include the gem and a lot of other dependencies,
right,
to get it working. But now it is just part of Rails. When you generate a new resource using the default generators, you also get system test templates with that. So you don't need to do a lot of things to set it up properly and make it work with other parts of Rails. So, for example, one of the biggest challenge before this was that as you know, the integration test, they have to reload a lot of data, right? I mean, you need to roll back some of the transactions to get to the earlier state. And that was always a painful task to do before Rails introduced this feature. Because in the unit test, the transactions get rolled back automatically in Rails. So you don't need to do anything extra. But otherwise, for feature tests or Capybara tests, you need to use tools like database cleaner to roll back to the previous state after each test is completed. But now you don't need to do that because that has become part of Rails itself. So Eileen Ushitel from Rails core team, she worked on this feature. And while working on the system test feature, she also did some refactoring on the database cleaning side. So now so basically that's what you get out of the box. Everything just works properly with the Rails internals, and it just comes out of the box from default Rails stack.
Yeah, with the Capybara test or system test in Rails 5.1 and later, you still do have to worry about getting your Chrome driver or the Gecko driver if you're doing a Firefox thing. So those are still system dependencies that you need. And depending on how you're doing it, like on your local Mac development environment or something, it's really not too bad. You could just do a brew install Gecko driver or Chrome driver, and typically it'll work, especially if you have Chrome and Firefox already installed. It gets a lot more annoying in CI/CD scenarios where there is no head, so there's no GUI, so you have to run in headless, and it just gets a bit more quirky. But I believe with system tests, you can still fall back to Poltergeist for the JavaScript driver to run the system tests.
Actually, Chrome has introduced a headless driver as well recently. So I think that can also be used now with the system tests. So that might solve some of the problems that are present only in CI with the headless browser thing.
Could you also hook in something like Cypress or some of those?
Yeah. Cypress is also a very interesting tool, and actually we have been exploring it in some of our projects at BigBinary. So what we're trying to do is use Cypress outside of Rails and give it a staging URL where we have the predefined data. So we have some projects where there is a lot of interaction between 2-3 portals, like the data flows from one portal to another. And then we have to do the tests such a way that the information flow is also tested. For example, some status message gets transmitted from portal 1 to portal 2, and then something changes in portal 1 based on that. So for testing that, the system tests are not really useful that are present in Rails. So a tool like Cypress allows us to basically hit different URLs and then come back and assert few tests. So we have been exploring with Cypress, and it has turned out to be good so far. The only issue in Cypress is that you have to basically make sure that the elements that you're using in your website are flexible enough so that your tests don't break when you change the UI. So that is the only thing. And you need to be aware of the DOM structure for finding out the paths of each of the element.
Yeah, and you also have to make sure that the data is consistent, because that's just a web or a front end for running the test. It doesn't actually run it at the system level. So you're not going to be able to do a database cleanup afterwards, are you?
Correct. So we do that through cron. Like every midnight, we run few tasks to reset the data properly. And it's in our staging environment, so it's completely fine to reset.
Yeah, cool. So I'm just going to throw this out there. I really hate testing. I mean, we all test to some degree. But you know, if you're going to do like some really good code coverage and good testing all your happy paths and end case scenarios, and if you're working with a really large application, you're going to end up having more tests than you do your actual business logic. And I mean, that is a good thing. You know, don't get me wrong, but that still doesn't change the fact that it's really annoying to write them sometimes.
Well, I'm with you there. I've been working a lot on this system to run the podcast, and I'll admit that I have a bunch of tests and they're all pending.
I remember a talk that I was given probably years and years back by Mike Moore, who's was a local Ruby guy here that ran the Mountain West RubyConf and is also the creator of many test rails. And he gave a talk about testing and how he essentially rated the value of tests from the outside in. Basically, if I remember right, and I was so amazed by it. I took photos back then of his slides, but if I remember right, he rated everything by value, and he said that you get the least amount of value typically from unit tests and the most amount of value from the overall integration tests. And it was very much about, like, people focus so much on writing these little tiny unit tests that they essentially test a single method, but at the end of the day, what you really need to make sure is tested is that cross-the-board integration, which, I mean, at the time it was fairly hard. I don't even think Capybara was out when he gave that presentation, but what are your thoughts on that?
One thing that I'll just add to that, you're saying that Mike basically stated that, you get the most value from the, end-to-end integration tests and the least value your any given unit tests. And I've more or less heard DHH say similar things, where he prefers the end-to-end testing as well, just because you can see that everything integrates properly and plays nicely together.
True, and unit tests sometimes don't actually give us a real confidence about whether it is working fine or not, because they are kind of superficial tests, at least in terms of website interactions. For example, if we think about the functional controller tests that were present before Rails 5, they might return the proper response back, but whether the page rendered correctly or whether there was some JavaScript error on the page which sort of caused some issue, we are not sure about it. So in such cases, end-to-end tests are really good, and they can give us 100% confidence that things are working properly. The other issue is that nowadays we use a lot of JavaScript in our front-end code. So just having unit tests doesn't mean that we are testing all the scenarios. And because of the use of complex JavaScript, it is not even sometimes easy to write the feature tests. And in such scenarios, end-to-end testing makes more sense in terms of coverage as well as in terms of accuracy.
So what's your testing approach then for Rails 5 applications? And I'm kind of asking in general of everybody.
So we are writing lots more feature specs than simple controller specs. We are sort of abandoned writing normal controllers tests that we used to write, and we are moving towards more and more integration tests. The model level unit test and other code, like unit tests for other codes, are still there, but we have almost skipped writing the controller tests that we used to write before.
Yeah, that makes sense. You keep mentioning the functional or controller tests, and I have almost never written those. I just found that they didn't always get me what I needed. It'd give me some HTML back or some JSON back, and I could kind of check the structure on it, but it didn't accurately portray what my app was supposed to be doing as well as a Capybara level test.
Actually, the funny thing about those functional level tests was that they were very easy to write. So you could write them very quickly. And Capybara tests, if you think about it, they take a lot of time to write. Like you have to build the page objects if you're using page objects, and then make sure that the page is getting loaded correctly. You have to know the DOM structure to write some of the code. So feature tests or Capybara tests are a bit hard to write, and sometimes that also means that you write a lot of controller tests because they are a bit easy to write. So I think that was also one of the reasons where a lot of people were writing those kind of tests.
That's definitely true. I've written some pretty long Selenium-based stuff, and those were painful to write. I mean, when they exercised, a happy path through the code or things like that, it definitely was worth it, but they weren't as much fun to write.
Yeah, I find that a lot of the Capybara tests that I write are super slow, just because some of the applications I work on are really large, and the amount of setup work or the initial work that has to be done to generate the database fields and the data in order to perform a feature test, it's just excruciatingly slow. So, I'm trying to find a better way to just inject the data while still using random sample data to see if things are working properly. But, for example, if you have a business which has many users and each one of those users are assigned to multiple business logic profiles, user will enter in data and then you run business logic calculations based on what profiles they're assigned to. All of that kind of initial setup work can be extremely slow if you're trying to test 1,000 different scenarios. So I try to do a lot more service object tests. So we have pretty skinny controllers and skinny models, and we kind of put everything in its own service object kind of place. And from there, we can test the individual service objects doing the smaller calculations, and then we can test combinations of those. And if we know those are going to work out correctly, then we can minimize the number of feature tests that we have or gear more towards just a happy path to make sure that the most critical aspects of our business function are being covered in the feature test. But some of the more, lesser critical things we're just covering heavily in the service object tests.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. The other path that we are taking in running the test is that don't run the feature tests in every pull request build. Because what happens sometimes is that, and that happened in one of our projects where there were around 20 to 25 developers working on that project at the same time. And everyone was pushing to Circle CI. And then everyone was waiting for like 1 or 2 hours because the feature tests were taking a lot of time. So initially we did some optimizations in the sequence in which the tests ran. And also we did some optimizations based on which tests should run. So that application was huge. It contained a lot of Rails engines and 2-3 Rails applications within a single repository, and all the specs ran every time. So we made some optimization to detect whether this particular application had changed or not in the code based on Git, and then only run tests for those. But all of those optimizations worked well for some time, and then because the tests were increasing every day, we were facing those problems again and again. So the best way, I think, in those scenarios is not to run all the tests all the time, but run them like twice a day or thrice a day instead of every pull request build.
Yeah.
Yeah,
we typically do it on
CI.
Yeah, we run our feature tests on the master branch. So whenever something gets, or a release branch. So if we are prepping a release or merging into master, then the feature test will run. Other than that, we just run our non-feature tests, on every push. So I had something else, but I lost it.
I'm gonna put myself out there and say I don't write integration tests. I very rarely write integration tests because it seems like every time I start testing, the tests that I'm writing are pre-interface. And for me to test interfaces, it's just never anything that I've actually built into my brain. And I can't really think of any companies aside from a long time ago, this one company, where I wrote integration tests and I didn't enjoy doing it. In fact, it was quite painful because they were all Selenium based. So, it's hard for me to look and say I can receive value from this. Where it's one of those things like I should exercise and diet, right? Because I know that at the end of the day I'll be happier. But freaking Big Macs are so damn good. What can you do? Same thing with, right? It's the same thing with integration tests and testing overall. I mean, I enjoy writing tests, but not integration tests because that interface keeps changing. Have you guys run into it where you're like, it's frustrating because you maybe change a CSS tag or you change this and that in the interface, and all of a sudden it breaks all your tests? Is that a thing?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But I think that we have a little bit of a mix in terminology. I usually refer to integration tests as where multiple components of the application are interacting with one another or with a third-party API or something. So it's not even necessarily using a user interface like a Selenium, and I usually call those feature tests or regression tests or system tests, what Rails 5.1 and later calls them. But I do try to avoid writing, as you said, Eric, the feature tests as much as possible. But integration tests, where you are testing interactions between maybe two different models or two different service objects, I think does have value, just to make sure they're not stepping on each other's toes. But the actual headless or Chrome drivers or the feature tests, I try to avoid, except for the happy paths.
Yeah, the other thing is when I'm testing, initially when I was writing these kinds of tests, it was really painful because I would specify in great detail the layout of the page, right? So it was, there should be this class, and inside it there should be this, I did with this class, and inside it there should be a table, and inside the table there should be a row with this information in it. And what I found is then I'd rearrange the page and it'd break all that stuff. And so what I wound up doing instead is the happy path was, it signs in, and the sign in interface is, usually pretty static if you're using something like Devise or something like that. So it signs in, and then it goes and it clicks on the add new widget button, and then it fills in the form. And again, most of those fields are going to be pretty stable, pretty static. I only have to change that if I change that form. And then when it takes me back out to either the show page or the index page, I just make sure that it shows up there somewhere, right? So it wasn't there before, and now it is. And by keeping it relatively simple, my criteria is essentially I can follow the happy path and create an object or an entity in the system that I can now interact with. And without specifying in great detail, it should show up in this row of the table, et cetera, et cetera. It allows it to be flexible enough to where I'm essentially just saying the critical functionality's there, and if there are any UX or UI concerns, I need to visually inspect those. But that's not a silver bullet. It helps with some of the issues where, every time you change the interface, you have an issue on your end-to-end test.
Yeah, we have a very similar approach to that as well, Chuck, where we don't try to dig through to find a very specific element. We just say, is it there on that page? All right, cool. But one thing I've found that I love doing is, especially on my CI/CDs, is adding in the parallel tests. So you can execute multiple jobs or multiple parallel tests at the same time. And that has significantly increased the amount of time or decreased the amount of time it takes our tests to run. Before they took an hour and a half or so. Now they run in 20 minutes.
Yeah, that's always an issue too. I mean, 20 minutes is still too long to run every time you commit on your local machine. I mean, before you don't want to sit there and wait for 20 minutes between finishing what you think you've got done and committing. But having CI and CD run it for you and give you feedback, possibly even before you run your next commit, depending on what you're building, that's really, really convenient.
Deploy more, pay less with DigitalOcean, the simplest all-in-one cloud computing platform for developers. Scale and run cloud applications faster and more efficiently with effortless administration tools to robust compute, flexible configurations, networking services, real-time alerts, and rapid provisioning, while enjoying industry-leading price to performance with a flat pricing structure across all global data center regions at any usage volume. Spend more time building better web apps and less time worrying about managing infrastructure with DigitalOcean. Build your next app on DigitalOcean. Get started with a free $100 credit at do.co/RubyRogues.
I've thought about lately, sometimes when things really go badly and everybody's figuring things out, it's this stuff that the CI did, the tests that we ran, that will go through a mental check. Okay, what do we know works, or how do we know it works? So it's almost like some of these things, like you guys are saying, we don't want to run them every time, and they're not really as helpful developing or deploying an app. But it's a lot more helpful when things go really wrong to say, not only do I get this stuff should work, but also sometimes it gives me breadcrumbs of, well, how do I know that it works? And then I can quickly, because if it's in the middle of the night and things are going wrong, and I found myself doing this last night. We were reading old tests to see, well, why does this system integrate this way? And then it gave me breadcrumbs to make sure it was okay. So I like that idea. If we can push it back into the CI and not worry about it, it's just stuff that runs some of the time, but it doesn't slow me down as a developer. It's really, really valuable to have it around after when I most need it.
One of the things I also do too is if I am noticing that on my CI that one of the tests failed, it's really hard to get visibility into why did it actually fail. Luckily, I have the code on my computer and I can execute that specific test on my own environment. But if you are using something like feature tests, the database is going to clean itself up and it's going to wipe out that data, so you kind of lose sight of it. So I usually have some environment variables I can pass in when I'm executing a test, and that's going to skip the cleanup job that gets ran to remove the data. And the script that I have also will take a dump of the test database, move it over into my development environment's test database, run any kind of post setup scripts that it has to do, whether it's reindexing the database or whatever, and then it'll restart the Rails application for me. So I can quickly run the failing test, run my script, and then right there on my development environment, I can go into the GUI or whatever to reproduce the issue to then debug why is that test failing.
That's wisdom right there. That's brilliant.
So are there any other parts of testing Rails in this way that have changed in Rails 5?
Not in the Rails 5. So in Rails 5, the main change was related to the functional controller tests, and then system tests were introduced later. And in Rails 6, parallel testing will also be introduced. So that feature will allow us to run the parallel tests in parallel using workers, threads, and using different databases at the same time. So as we discussed, we can run that in CI right now using gems like parallel tests. But now after Rails 6, it will also be possible to run it locally using different databases and using different workers and threads. So that feature is merged into master right now, and it will be part of the next release. It will be basically part of the default stack. So we can just use it to run tests parallelly.
Yeah, I love the idea of parallel tests. Do you know how they're implementing that? Is that done through just by forking processes, or are they doing things like, spinning up multiple Docker images or anything like that?
No. So the default way is using forking processes. I think for JRuby, it will work a bit differently. I don't think there is any involvement of running Dockers, because that is very custom setup for every application. So this has to be made in such a way that it is applicable to all Rails applications, almost all Rails applications. So it will just use the forking mechanism.
And I know with the parallel test gem, it uses multiple databases. It just uses a increment number based on which process or however many number of processes you're using. Is the Rails 6 approach taking that same route where it's going to use multiple databases, one for each test or test process?
Correct. Yes. So for each process, it will have a database with that particular number. So database 0, 1, 2, 3, and in that way.
So, funny story about running parallel tests. I got a Mac Pro on sale, iMac Pro. So I never had a computer with so many threads available. So I went to run the test on one of our large applications, and the system just completely freaked out. It had no idea what to do with so many parallel Ruby processes going at the same time. And the database engine just completely died on me. I had no, it was actually really hard to troubleshoot because it was all the settings for that environment for the database engine. I had to really beef up its specs and settings in order to handle 24 or 32 processes going at it at the same time. First world problem, I guess.
Speaking about issues with Apple, so it's been, dude, I swear I have bad. This is like a personal offset story, but it's fun to share. Recently, my MacBook Pro, I had this custom ordered high-end MacBook Pro, like maxed out, die on me. The keyboard died and I couldn't reset it, and the whole thing was just kind of bonkers. So I took it down to the Apple store and I said, hey, the keyboard's broken and I can't restart it. So can you please fix it? So they had to ship it off to a company. In the meantime, I'm out of a computer, so I bought another one. I bought another a 15-inch, their latest 15-inch. Now, again, this is a month ago, right? The latest 15-inch I purchased, and I had 2 weeks to return it. So I get this computer, and they email me because I expect to get this other one back within 2 weeks for sure, so I can return the new one. So they email me and they say, hey, we cannot fix your computer. We're going to send you a brand new one. Your warranty resets. You can repurchase Apple Care. Anything you want to do, but you're going to get a brand new one. Okay, fine. So now I'm like, okay, I have to commit to this new laptop that I bought because I'm going to have to wait for more than 2 weeks to get this other one back. So the other one gets back, and so I can't sell the dang thing. And on top of that, Apple literally released, like the day after I get the laptop back, a brand new set of laptops. And so like, instant devaluation of this thing. And I'm like, no. So here I am. I have two laptops. One of them I haven't even opened yet. I can't sell the dang thing. And there's a brand new one that I just bought, which is already out of date. So again, first world problem right there.
That's funny.
You should have gone for a Mac Mini. Then again,
I thought about it. Yeah. I
or
thought
they're
about
getting
it, but I'm like,
refreshed.
it's just one of those things. You buy it, and the next day it's out of date.
Yeah. So Prathamesh, we talked a whole bunch about secrets of testing Rails 5 apps. What are the hidden features of Rails 5? What did you talk about at RubyConf PH?
So at RubyConf Philippines, I talked about some of the features in Rails 5 that are not really talked about a lot. For example, there are some features which are like version migrations. So what happens is that when some of the Rails internal API changes, then our migrations, which sometimes depend on some of the internal code, that they might fail. For example, sometimes new keys are added to support a particular, let's say, foreign keys, right? So let's say there is a new key that has been added that sets up the foreign keys across multiple tables. And during the Rails upgrades, the Rails team has to take care of making sure that while changing the API, you don't accidentally break the migrations of old applications. But now what will happen is that each migration will get a version number. So that way it becomes easier to manage the API changes across different versions. So for example, the API has changed for foreign keys, and a new option has been added for, let's say, adding some constraint. And that option will only be applicable from Rails 5.2 onwards. So the migrations that are created before that will not have any effect, because they will have a specific version that, okay, they have a version of Rails 5.1. So the migrations that are created for 5.2 and 5.1 will be independent of each other. So that is one of the small change that was not talked about a lot. Apart from that, there were some changes related to testing as well, which we discussed earlier. Then there was a change about rendering views outside of the controller actions. So normally what happens is that we render the views in our controllers, we render views or JSON responses. But now with the introduction of this change, we can actually render the views in our background jobs as well. So if you want to return a template from your code which is not part of any controller, that is now possible. And that helps in scenarios where, let's say, you have a WebSocket based page where you want to return some response from the WebSocket response using action cable. And now it is possible to use the same view template, but return that response outside of the normal request response flow. So I talked about such features which are not the like which are not the main features of Rails 5, but still very useful features for developers. Like some of the features were also related to caching. For example, earlier the rendering of individual items in the fragment caching was done in a slower way because it was rendering each partial one by one. But now that happens in parallel, like all the partials are fetched in a single request. So that speeds up the process of rendering collection fragments. So there was a gem earlier, multi-page fragments for this particular task, and that became part of Rails 5 itself. So, yeah.
I'm not sure if I completely followed that. So you can render your templates using a job?
Yes. So basically, earlier, what used to happen was that you can only render your templates using controllers, right? In the controller, you can render a particular view or a particular JSON response and so on. Now, what happens is that there is an API for the renderer object itself, which can be used outside of the controller code. So you don't need to have the controller to render a response. You can just use that particular API and directly render the response outside of your controller action. So typically what happens is that to render a response, you also need a request, right? Because request, you first get the request, you process that request, and based on that, you return the response. And response is usually returned in the same format as the request format that came in. But now with this new API, you can also build a kind of an environment, like a mock environment for that request. So we can render responses without having a request. And that helps in scenarios where you want to return a particular page, let's say through action cable, because you don't have a request for that, but something happened, you need to now return the response, right? So that is now possible.
Yeah, I did a Drift and Ruby episode on the action controller renderer in the past. I think it was back in 2016. And since then, I found it exactly like you said, using it in action cable or some other kind of transaction where we're not really in a controller, but we're outside of that domain entirely, but we still need to render a view and have that pushed up to the client to refresh just a portion of their page.
Right. And what it allows us to do is basically keep the view same. So we can have the same partial, which will be used for normal request response, and which can also be used for this purpose where you just need to return the response. So it makes sense to keep the logic in the view side rather than. So earlier, I remember sometimes we have to make some changes in the JavaScript to support this kind of feature. Where you don't want to send a response, where you don't want to send a request to the server, but still want to make some changes. But now what happens is that your code becomes a lot less duplicated because the same code, same view code can be used for multiple purposes.
Mm-hmm. And it's also really awesome for doing cache swarming. So if you're doing some fragment caching within your view, you can send the job into the background to Sidekick or Rescue or something and actually have it re-render that view, and it'll regenerate the cache from the view. So that way, next time the user comes to that page, it's going to still load up quickly with the new data because it doesn't have to recalculate all of the stuff that you may have had in the view. Instead, it's already loaded into your cache store from the background job having re-ran that once the cache was stale.
True. That is also possible.
So what are we looking forward to in Rails 6? I mean, you mentioned the parallel testing. Are there other features that are coming?
Parallel testing is one of the changes. Then there will be some changes, I think, related to performance as well. Eileen Ushitel gave a talk at RailsConf this year about having scalable by default. Rails having scalable by default. So she's working on some of the performance-related changes, which will be present in Rails 6. So I think, so it will be faster, I think, than the previous releases.
It's been hard to get information on the new Rails coming out, but I'm excited for it. You know, as some of you know, I've switched over to Elixir, and every single day as I'm in Elixir, I'm thinking to myself, man, I miss Ruby. I miss working in this environment that speaks my language. So yeah, this is always a breath of fresh air on this podcast because I can get back to my roots and the language that I truly love.
There was also a recent pull request by DHH to change to Webpacker by default in Rails 6 applications. So earlier, the asset pipeline was used to compile JavaScript, CSS images by default. But now, and Webpacker was provided as an optional like gem, which you can use when you start a new Rails application. But now with Rails 6, the Webpacker will become default for compiling JavaScript, and then asset pipeline will be used to compile CSS images and other stuff. So that will also be a very good change, because then you can use the npm packages or any other JavaScript world packages by default.
Yeah, I like Webpacker, so I'm looking forward to seeing what we get from that. All right, well, anything else we should jump on before picks? All right, I will take the silence as no, there's nothing else.
Do you run your own freelance business? Or maybe you're thinking about picking up some business on the side? Well, then you need FreshBooks. FreshBooks is the quickest and easiest way to get invoices out to your clients. It's easy to use. It works anywhere, available from any device, on the desktop, iPhone, iPad, Android, and all of your data is backed up and secure. And it makes it really easy to get organized and get paid. You'll be tracking time, logging expenses, and invoicing your clients in no time. You can also save time billing, freeing up several days per month to focus on the work that you love, and you get paid faster. FreshBooks customers are paid on average 5 days faster because there's a link on the invoice that says pay me now. And it's a great way to grow your business. Plus, FreshBooks is offering a 30-day trial. That's right, 30-day trial if you try them out. So go to gofreshbooks.com/devchat and enter devchat in the How Did You Hear About Us section. Once again, for a 30-day trial, go to gofreshbooks.com/devchat and enter devchat in the How Did You Hear About Us section.
Let's go ahead and do some picks. Eric, do you want to start us off?
Yeah. So my pick is a little bit off topic today. And recently I found out, actually I was with Chuck when I found this out, that my sister, that somebody that I know is experiencing domestic abuse. And she's a mother of 4 children and somebody I care for deeply. And it's really hard to see this happen, and the emotions that go along with domestic abuse and the justifications and the feelings of I deserve this are not only unfounded, but it's just so hard to be able to look at that and say you need to get out. So I wanted to share today as my pick the hotline.org, which is the website that provides a hotline for anybody experiencing this to call or chat or talk and get some help if you are experiencing domestic abuse. It's a real issue. It shouldn't be happening, but it does, and there is help out there. And if you are experiencing this, please get help. The phone number is 1-800-799-7233, or the website is thehotline.org.
And that doesn't just apply to women, too. I mean, if you're a guy, if you're experiencing that, put aside any kind of, shame that you may have and just call. Because, I was in a really abusive relationship where this woman would just wail on me, and it's not right. So, definitely second that.
Yeah, and I just want to back into this a little bit as well. Not all abuse is physical as well. I think the physical abuse is the easiest to spot, and is probably the kind of abuse that makes me the angriest, that one person would do that to another. But yeah, if you're undergoing some kind certain types of emotional abuse or other mistreatment like that at that level, please get help. I have an uncle that went through years and years and years of that kind of abuse. It was all emotional abuse, emotional blackmail involving his kids. And he eventually, got out of that relationship. But he's never quite been the same. And it's really sad to see that, it's kind of held him back from being as happy as he could be. And so, you know what? There are a lot of emotional things that go on there, but definitely get help. Dave, do you have some picks for us?
Yeah, sure. On a little bit lighter note, a book. So I have never recommended a book on the show because I really don't read books, but my wife has forced me to read this one, and rightfully so. It's called Boundaries with Kids. It's about how to, try to approach and raise your children and discipline them, because it's a problem that we have with our son. He is just wild, all boy, destructive, and destroys everything. And he's starting to now get in that age of talking back. So the title of the book is Boundary with Kids, When to Say Yes, When to Say No, to help your children gain control of their lives. So if you have little munchkins that are terrorists, then definitely check out that book. And the other pick I have is a tool. So Chuck, you may like this one. It is Rhino ramps. So they are these really industrial strength plastic that are ramps for your car, so you can get your car up on some stands to actually do some undercarriage work. So it's great for changing oils or anything else that you need to do under the car if you have just a foot of clearance that you need. And they're only like $40. So to get your car lifted up on both wheels for $40, not too bad.
Yeah, I remember my dad had some of those when I was a kid. we used to come up with creative ways of using them. We'll just put it that way.
Put a piece of plywood on there and take your bike over it. No, we never did that.
No, that's neither. All right. I'm going to jump in here with a few picks. So I've been doing a bunch of work on this system for managing the podcasts. And I've just been having a lot of fun. I actually kind of pulled an all-nighter last night because I was just enjoying it. So I'm just going to, pick writing code for fun. Even though this is for work, it's been fun to work on. So I'm going to pick that. And then there's a system that I was playing with the other day, and I'm trying to remember what it's called. It's called Notion.so. And I'm trying to think of how to describe it. So it has task lists, right? So you can put to-do lists in it, but it also has places for you to put things like notes and documents and things like that. And it all integrates nicely together, a little bit more nicely than things like Google Docs, which is what I've been using for this kind of thing otherwise. So I'm going to pick that as well if you want to go check it out. So far, it's been free. I don't know at what point they make you pay for it, but I've been pretty happy with it so far. So I'm going to pick that. And then since I did mention the podcasting app, I am looking for a few folks. If you're running a podcast here within the next week or so, I'm going to be wanting to add people into the system just to get a few more use cases that aren't mine and make sure that it works for other podcasters. So if you're interested in that, just email me, chuck@devchat.tv. Prathamesh, what are your picks?
My first pick is RubyConf India. Next year will be 10th edition of RubyConf India. It will be in Goa. So if you want to come and visit India and enjoy Goa, that will be the best time because it will be in January, 20th and 21st of January. Mads is going to be there. Charles Nutter is also going to be there. And our CFP is also open. So if you're interested in giving a talk, please submit the talk. There is a lot of time still. It will be open till November, end of November. So a lot of time to go. And my second pick is our blog series on Ruby 2.6. So we have written a few blogs on what are the upcoming features in Ruby 2.6, and we will be adding some more blogs. So Ruby 2.6 will be released in December this year, and there are a lot of interesting features that are coming up. So if somebody wants to take a look at what are the new features, please check our blog. One of the funny thing that happens with these blogs is that when you search for something after a few years, and there is a high chance that you can end up on your own blog. So that's why we sort of write these blogs, because they are useful to us as well. So yeah, these are the two picks.
Awesome. And if people want to find you online, where you're blogging or committing code or stating your opinion about things, where do they go?
You can find me on Twitter and GitHub. I don't tweet that much, but still I'm active there.
All right. Well, thank you for coming and chatting with us for a few minutes.
Thank you. It was fun.
Thank you so much.
All right. We'll wrap this up and we'll catch everyone next week.
Bandwidth for this segment is provided by CacheFly, the world's fastest CDN. Deliver your content fast with CacheFly. Visit CACHEFLY.com to learn more.